Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and I'm back with Mike DeBernardis, partner at Hughes Hubbard Reed, and we are going to explore the first FCPA enforcement action, or perhaps declination is the better way to phrase it, for 2025, and that involved the insurance company Liberty Mutual. For that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome back, Mike.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. And I'm happy to talk about this one. And I'm a big fan of Limu the Emu. This one hit close to home.
Okay, I hadn't even thought about that angle. This was a declination and it was a really paucity of information, but I thought it had some interesting points in it, Mike. And I wanted to start with one that struck me as something I'm not sure we've explored, and that's the following. We have talked about self disclosure, we've talked about that this may be the most difficult discussion you can have with a client, but I'm not sure we've talked about that discussion in the context of we have found something, but we have not completed our investigation. And we think it's a violation, but we're not completely sure yet. So how do you, one, overlay that level of uncertainty? But what does that do for someone like you or your colleagues who then have to investigate when it could get worse and maybe it'll get better and you're going to have a very strong someone over your shoulder looking at you situation?
Yeah. And to put that in the context of this case, there's not a ton of information here, but we know that the company disclosed their violation, I think it was March 2024, during, and the declaration notes that it was during the investigation. And under the newer corporate enforcement policy, the requirement is that you disclose at the earliest possible time, even when you've not completed your investigation. It used to be, under the old version, immediately upon becoming aware of the alleged misconduct. We're in a position now where there's pressure to disclose early. To me, the challenge is not having to disclose before you've sort of confirmed the conduct, because I view that as too early. All right. So at least under the existing metrics, the challenge is once we have gathered evidence sufficient to say we think there is a material risk that there was a violation here. Now we're in a position where I think there's an expectation that we will disclose. The challenge to me is we don't know how bad it is. So we are opening the door here by self-disclosing without really knowing what we fully have. And that's the challenge. And that's what clients are rightfully going to ask. What's our exposure here? What are we looking at? I think it's really difficult for defense attorneys in particular to go and sort of open the Komodo, so to speak, without knowing what's underneath. We always like to know, at least I always like to know. This is why we always encourage clients, let's do an investigation. We got to figure out, I can't advise you really well until we know. And so you're put into this very kind of uncomfortable position of trying to advise your client without knowing. That knowledge is power, as they say, and it's really powerful when it comes to these investigations. But you can really make very informed decisions when you know what has happened. It is much more difficult to make those decisions when you don't know for sure the extent of what's happened. And that's the position we're in. I think it's really, starting with the old version of the corporate enforcement policy, really starting 5-6 years ago with kind of the change in timing for self-disclosure, voluntary disclosure decisions. It's really kind of had to change how investigations attorneys go about their jobs. And it's still an adjustment for me personally.
So over the years, we have talked about that initial change from what I call double secret speed. I can't tell you what it is, but we know it when we see it immediately upon first rumor of a whiff of something might be wrong, that we heard from Kenneth Polite, and to a different standard now. Do you think we actually have moved to, I don't want to say more reasonable standard because you're still disclosing before you know all the facts, but at least not, oh my God, we've got something. Number two, we got to call the DOJ.
Yeah, I hope so. There's certainly the change in language in the most recent corporate enforcement policy suggests that to me. Maybe I'm viewing this optimistically, but I think that's consistent with several of the changes that were made, where there's an appetite for declinations. If you put too much pressure on companies to disclose too soon, I think there is a risk from the government's perspective. You're losing part of your customer base, so to speak, right? You're taking companies out who either weren't comfortable disclosing right away, maybe just kind of missed their window, or afraid they missed their window, and so now they're not coming forward. So I think in general, this approach is meant to encourage more self-reporting. And I think that was the goal. And so I am approaching it as though this is a more liberal policy in terms of the timing. We're not back to the old days, unfortunately, but we're at a place where companies are expected to, as quickly as possible, get their hands around what has happened. And then as early as possible, after they have their handle on what's happened, and that's not every single detail, but generally a handle on what's happened, come and report it to the DOJ.
My full cooperation has been a requirement for several years. We've talked about what we think that means, but there was a little bit different language in this declination. It said full and proactive cooperation. Okay. Could we maybe focus on that word proactive and try to unpack that? And if we can't figure out what the DOJ means, perhaps we can figure out what we mean if we would use that. It seemed to be providing information to the Department of Justice before they ask, but that may be way too simple. So when you see that word, does that mean something different to you from full because it's a separate word?
It means something different to me than full. I'm happy not to see the word extraordinary, because under the old guidance, I did not know what that meant. I think proactive is easier to understand. Full cooperation is everything you've asked for, we've given you. You cannot say we have not cooperated. You've asked, we've given it to you. We've given it to you in a timely manner. We've given it to you in a complete manner. We have cooperated fully. Proactive is, you point out the simplistic approach to it, but I think that's essentially what it is. We're not just responding to what you ask for, but we're anticipating what you might find useful in your investigation, and we're just giving it to you. So here's some additional documentation that you didn't ask for, but is useful. Here's a presentation that we can give you on some of the facts that we've discovered. Here's some translations you haven't asked for, but we've done. We went ahead and started dealing with data privacy issues in India where this happened, so that we could give you these materials before you asked for them. So it's for me, it's a better term than extraordinary. I think it's easier to understand conceptually. I think anybody who's done this, with whether it's with the DOJ or any other regulator, knows when they're cooperating and knows when they are proactively cooperating and knows the difference. And to me, I prefer this term over kind of the old term. I don't know for sure if they're intending to kind of use this on a go-forward basis, or it just happened to be in this declination, but this is a standard I think that is easier to understand.
Mike, I first heard the term deconfliction from Lanny Brewer. That's how far back it goes. And so I was wondering, what might it be like when the Department of Justice not is directing your investigation, but saying, we would like you to explore this, or we don't want you to explore that. And I was in a situation where it was it was the former, and they wanted us to look at a country we didn't think we had a problem with, because there was some other investigation from another unit within the DOJ we knew nothing about, and they wanted to data mine us for that. So when you have a confliction or a deconfliction, how would you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really difficult situation. Once you've opened the door to cooperation, it's hard to draw the boundaries. But that's part of the job. I think that's part of the job for the investigations attorney. It's part of knowing when to push and when not to push. I am hopeful that under kind of the revised approach, at least to FCPA investigations, there will be fewer requests to expand the investigation. I think there seems to be, at least in the written form, an effort to limit investigations to the conduct at issue, to not require companies to kind of keep expanding the circle and doing these never-ending investigations. That effort seems to be designed to limit impact on business operations, also ensure that investigations are finished sooner. But to the extent you are engaging with the Department of Justice and they ask you for things, deconfliction is one thing. I think it's not easy to deal with, but we've got sort of years of history in how to handle those situations with interviewing certain witnesses, waiting for others, and that type of thing. And usually those can be resolved pretty amicably. But asking to expand an investigation into new spaces, that's a very judgment call, very much a judgment call as to how much to push. I think right now, I haven't had the opportunity yet. I think right now there is potentially more leeway to push on those types of requests than there would have been 2-3 years ago, in terms of here's what your guidance says, and this is supposed to be limited, and we think it should be limited. To your point, we've got no evidence that there's anything going on in this other business unit or this other geography. So we should really be able to ring fence this investigation.
There was another word used in the declination letter that I typically don't see, and I'll see if I can pull up the language. Liberty Mutual's timely and appropriate remediation, including the company's early and fulsome acceptance of responsibility. So let's focus on fulsome. Any thoughts on how you can accept responsibility in a fulsome way as opposed to just regular accepting responsibility?
That's good. I think that's an interesting term. I'll be curious to see if we see that again. I laugh because it's in some ways silly, but also I can see it, right? You have situations where you are willing to say, hey, we agree. We did it. This is on us. This is on Liberty. This is on us as Liberty Mutual. It was our responsibility to prevent our Indian subsidiary from doing what it did. We did not do that. We take full responsibility for everything that has happened, everything we've disclosed. And then you have situations where, for various reasons, the acceptance of responsibility is we have policies and procedures in place. Our Indian subsidiary did not, follow those. Look, there was things we could have done better for the purposes of getting this resolved. We agree. We will accept responsibility. And it's sort of it's a gentler approach to accepting responsibility. I don't know if that's what happened here, right? I don't know if this was just somebody added an extra word in there to make it seem like it was better than acceptance of responsibility. But I do know, because I've had to do it both ways, that there is actually a sliding scale in terms of accepting responsibility, which is why I kind of chuckled.
I applauded and approved that they specifically called out the root cause analysis and the systemic use of the root cause analysis to remediate the compliance program. Could you say a few words about the importance in your mind of a root cause analysis when you have a catastrophic failure leading to an FCPA violation?
I think root cause analysis of various degrees are important for any type of failure. I mean, obviously, in something like this, where we're talking about now a major violation of the FCPA, that should be a no-brainer. But I'm often talking to clients about we've identified this misconduct. All right, we're going to fire the person. I think we've taken care of it, and we're going to issue a statement and about the importance of let's figure out how this happened. We know that this employee did something inappropriate. We get that, and we can figure out how he did it, but basically, how was it allowed? Where was the failure, if there was one, and usually there was, where was the failure within the company's control environment that allowed this to happen? Sometimes it's a glaring hole. Oh, actually, we don't even have a policy on that. Or we have a policy on that, but it's not really well implemented. Sometimes it's like a nuance, right? We have a policy on that, but we haven't really trained our finance people that well. They just missed this and allowed it to happen. But doing that analysis to figure out where in the chain where this was supposed to be stopped, was it not stopped, and why is critically important. I think, to be honest with you, I think companies have been doing this for a long time, but maybe not framing it as a root cause analysis. And I think you can get a lot of credit when you take what you've done and I'm not saying make something up, but frame it around this concept of a root cause analysis. It doesn't take a lot of additional work, maybe take some reorganization, and you can get a lot of credit for that, and it can have a lot of value.
Mike, there's another phrase that I had not remembered seeing in an enforcement action or declination, but I think it's completely appropriate. And I will just read it to you. Went through the remediation steps the company took that we've seen before, but then they added one, including with respect to the use of social media and ephemeral messaging applications for business purposes. Well, I find that completely appropriate is certainly on the ephemeral messages, but I've not recall seeing social media. Is this something that, I guess, what are your initial thoughts, and how would you have that conversation with a client around social media messaging as opposed to ephemeral messaging?
Yeah, it makes me wonder here whether there was something in the investigation that revealed that people were communicating using Facebook Messenger or some sort of social media communication. Because I haven't seen that before either. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't necessarily think of separating that out from sort of messaging applications unless it sort of came up in the investigation. I agree with you. I think it's appropriate. We have had numerous conversations with clients about the use of messaging apps. Some clients are being very proactive, making changes based on the expectation, the compliance program expectations and everything else. Others are finding it very difficult from a business perspective, and so maybe aren't being quite as proactive. And I think, unfortunately, for some of those, it's going to take an incident to cause you to sort of make the change. These policies with respect to ephemeral messaging applications as part of remediation, I think if we did an analysis in the last 3-4 years, we'd see it's probably listed in more TPAs and the like than we saw previously, because it's now part of most schemes. The use of ephemeral messaging and messaging apps and taking things out of email environment is part of more and more fraudulent schemes, more and more corrupt schemes. And so companies are having to respond with stricter policies once you do the investigation, realize, oh, the employees were using Signal, okay, or they were using the auto delete function in Teams or whatever it is, and having to address those issues. We've seen that more and more as the use of those applications has become more ubiquitous, and I think companies, frankly, are still behind in their policies and procedures with relation to those types of apps.
Mike, after going through this declination letter in some detail, I actually think there's quite a bit in here to unpack. And I guess the maybe last thought I'd like you to comment on is I have another one of our colleagues who essentially has told me for 15, maybe even 20 years, the DOJ always communicates its expectations. And they do that in speeches, they do that in different written documents, but they do that in enforcement actions. And it seems like, as much as I thought this was about as plain Jane as you could get, there's actually quite a bit in here that would allow you as a CCO to either think about or pressure test your own compliance program to see if you meet the basic minimum requirements of prevent, detect, and remediate. Any real thoughts on how you or the firm would use something that we both thought was perhaps a little plain Jane, but able to use that really to help advise and counsel your clients?
You and I have discussed before that I'm of the view, whether intentionally or not, when the DOJ makes a policy change, they are eager to demonstrate it. And that can be frustrating in this context, because if you make a policy change on January 1st, 2025, it can be years before a case is ripe enough that you can demonstrate to the public that, no, we meant it, or here's what we meant by it. I've mentioned this in past podcasts. I've found that in some ways, over the last few years, they've tried to find cases to shoehorn in their new policies. We saw this, I think it was Albemarle, maybe with the clawback provision, where that conduct had been done years before they announced the new policy, but they're really trying to demonstrate how it would work in practice. So part of me wonders if this declination isn't sort of a signal. We've got this revised corporate enforcement policy. We are serious that we're going to give declinations if you meet these criteria. Here's an example. Even though they disclosed well before the new policy, here's an example of how we're going to treat this. Here's an example of what we expect in terms of cooperation. We can use our new language, full and proactive. Here's what we're looking for remediation. I could be off base. I know that. But as I'm talking to clients about why this might matter, those are the types of things we're pointing to. This is a breadcrumb for something they want you to know. More broadly, to me, this signals a couple things. One, this administration is willing to give declinations. Two, we're back in business of actually doing corporate enforcement. I mean, this had to be approved by DOJ leadership. They did. They were not doing that for several months while the FCPA was paused. We were back to sort of approving it. And three, and I'm not leaning on this too much, but this does not fit neatly in any of the categories that were laid out in the June memo on the sort of new FCPA enforcement. There were 5 or 6 categories that were going to be sort of frame FCPA enforcement. This does not fit neatly in any of those categories. That could simply be a matter of timing, right? This case started back in 2024. They had this sort of declination sitting there. You might as well do it. Or it could be a sign that, yes, look, that's going to be our focus. These 5 or 6 categories are going to be where we focus our investigation efforts. It doesn't mean that if you're not in one of those categories, it's off the table, or it's not that we don't care about those. And so I am keeping that in the back of my mind, especially as issues might come up for clients where we have a similar situation where, look, this looks like it's outside of these focus areas. That doesn't mean the risk is zero.
Mike, as always, a great pleasure. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks very much, Tom.